There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from understanding yourself too well. You've named the patterns, you know your attachment style, your wounds, the precise shape of what was done to you and what it cost. You can describe it with a fluency that surprises people. And yet, somewhere underneath all that clarity, something hasn't moved. You're still here. Still explaining, still working on it. The vocabulary keeps getting more precise. The freedom keeps getting more theoretical. You might have noticed that the more you learn about what's wrong, the more there is to learn. Each new framework opens a door into another room of yourself you hadn't cataloged yet. And every door feels like progress, even though you've been walking through them for years now without ever stepping outside. Michel Foucault spent his life mapping this exact problem from the outside. He studied prisons, hospitals, clinics, confessionals, the places where societies decided what was normal and what needed correction. His work became a kind of liberation language for generations of thinkers who wanted to expose how power hides itself inside what we call care, what we call knowledge, what we call helping. He gave people the vocabulary to see the bars they hadn't noticed, and then he noticed something stranger. The act of naming the cage was producing more cage. The discourse of freedom was building its own architecture. The more sophisticated your analysis of how you were being shaped, the more you became shaped by the act of analyzing. He had described a trap, and then watched the trap absorb his description and use it as another wall. This is what may be happening quietly inside you. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because the human nervous system is unusually good at converting any explanation of suffering into a stable identity. When you find a framework that finally makes sense of your pain, a diagnosis, a theory, a community, a language, something in you exhales. Finally, there is a shape to it. Finally, you are legible to yourself. But legibility is sticky. Once you've organized yourself around a way of being understood, that understanding becomes part of how you exist. To put it down would mean becoming illegible again. Unknown. Without a story for why you are the way you are. And that, to the nervous system, can feel less like freedom and more like falling. So the analysis deepens. You read more, you attend more. You discover more subtle layers of what was done to you, what you've internalized, what you're still working through. Each layer feels like progress because it produces more articulate suffering. And articulate suffering is rewarded. People listen, communities form. You become someone who knows things, specifically who knows the precise contours of your own confinement. This is the quiet incentive nobody names. Being the most lucid person in the room about your own pain is a kind of status. It's a domain where you're the expert. Leaving the framework would mean leaving the expertise. The clarity you've earned would lose its audience. And without realizing it, you may have built an entire identity that depends on the suffering remaining nameable, ongoing, in process. Notice the language. In process. Still healing, working through it, doing the work. These phrases protect you from a question you may not be ready to ask. What would it mean to simply be done? Not cured, not transcendent, just done examining, done explaining, done referencing the wound as the central feature of who you are. For many people, that question produces something like panic. Because if you're not the person working through this, who are you? If the framework dissolves, what holds you together? The pattern protects you from that vertigo by ensuring there is always more to understand, always a deeper layer, always one more piece of work to do before the actual living can begin. You can see this same shape in many places now. In wellness spaces where every insight produces a new course to take. In therapy that becomes a decades-long conversation with no exit, because exit would feel like abandonment. In communities organized around shared pain where claiming actual relief is treated as denial or naivety, and the people who quietly leave are quietly resented. In coaching programs where you are perpetually almost ready, almost aligned, almost free. In political and ideological frameworks where the language of liberation requires constant performance, and any question about the framework itself signals that you haven't done enough work to see clearly. In each case, the structure is the same. A language that promised to free you became a language you now live inside. You can describe your captivity with great precision. You just can't leave. And this isn't because you're weak or self-deceiving. It's because the framework worked at first. It really did help. It gave you a way to make sense of something formless, and that mattered. The pattern only became a pattern because the original relief was real. You kept reaching for it. The reaching itself became the cage. There is no shame in noticing this. Foucault didn't write his work to make people feel foolish for using it. He was pointing at a strange feature of how minds and systems interact, how the very tools we use to see ourselves can become the things we cannot see past. What you might allow yourself to consider is this. Somewhere between the diagnosis and the discourse, and the endless layers of self-examination, there is a person. Just a person. Not a case study, not a survivor narrative, not a work in progress. Someone who could, in principle, set down the entire apparatus and simply walk through a day without referencing the wound. You don't have to do that. You don't have to do anything, but you can notice that you've been carrying something. The frameworks, the vocabularies, the constant interpretation of yourself to yourself. You can notice the weight of it. You can notice that some part of you has confused the carrying with being alive. This is the pattern. You have lived it. The language that was supposed to free you became the place you live. And now you can see its shape, not as something to fight, not as one more thing to analyze, but as something you have been holding for a long time, perhaps longer than you needed to.